it's really a pleasure to see you and have a chance to share your experience. And I know that your experience has been mostly as a consultant to Alpha Bank, and we're going to
No, no,
no, it's
no,
not.
no.
Okay. All
That was
right. Well, let me take that back. Why don't you start by telling me how you got involved with Russia and what you ended up doing?
Well, it started with the project at Alpha Bank, which was an incredible experience, but ended pretty quickly with the crash of the banking system in 1998.
I
Uh,
see.
and so that was, the project only lasted about a year, but by that time I had made some very interesting friends, and so I my my life took several different turns. One was that I became, as a result of the Alpha Bank experience, a great believer in internships as a mechanism for teaching people, and which was, by the way, not at all what the World Bank wanted my project to be. They had such a stupid idea, and I'm happy to be on record about that, is how they wanted it done, that I basically said I wouldn't even know how to do that. I wouldn't know how to staff that. It doesn't make any sense to me. And so they came around and let me do what I wanted to do because they needed an American bank, and we were the only American bank that had applied to have it. And Alpha Bank wanted us.
Yeah.
Um,
Step audio. Um, I'm sorry, can't take it. Can you actually go back and just give me a sense of your background before you got involved in this? So, when people are listening to this, they'll have a sense of, what your expertise was, what your experience was, and then you're getting involved with the Alpha Bank moving forward.
well, I worked in commercial banking in Atlanta first at what was then the Trust Company Bank, now is Truist Bank. And then I came to Philadelphia in 1983 with Philadelphia National Bank, which is now, went through and finally got bought out and is now Wells Fargo. But so I had what would that be, 25 or 30-year career with them. What does that add up to? I don't even know. Well, I retired in 1999, so 1983 to 1999, about 20 years. Um, and um, and I did I was on the commercial banking side of an area called cash management, which I think is not done much anymore for a variety of reasons that are not relevant here, and strategic planning and stuff like that. Um, and I had a friend who Russian friend who I'd helped get a job at our bank, and she told me about this project. She was made the Russian country manager for our bank. And I said, I was fascinated by the idea. I'm basically a project person. And I was fascinated by the idea because I've always been sort of fascinated with Russia. And it just sounded like a lot of fun and very interesting thing to do. So I sort of was like the camel with the nose under the tent because I wasn't in the international department. I was in the commercial banking area at that time. And so I wrote the proposal and staffed the team and so on and so forth for
So
the
this was a response to an RFP from the World
yes,
Bank?
yes, yes,
Okay. And what
yeah.
did the World Bank want to accomplish?
Well, the idea was to is actually an interesting idea. They wanted to teach Russian banks Western banking technology in the sense of organizational structure, uh, standards for behavior, just basically how the banking world worked essentially. And they wanted to do it by pairing up Russian banks with European banks and American banks. As I say, our bank was the only bank that applied for the project from the United States, and they wanted to have at least one. So,
Mhm. And
so
what year was this?
we probably started working on this in 1996.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
So it was pretty late after the fall of the Soviet Union.
correct. Yes,
And okay. Okay.
right. Um, yeah. So it was an interesting idea. There was a lot of the banks that were selected to be part of the project ultimately failed. And there was lots of analysis done as to why the World Bank picked the banks it picked, which, people thought they had not been a good choice. Alpha Bank,
That
however,
is the Russian banks
the
failed.
Russian banks, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
But Alpha Bank was an extremely good choice. And I mean, they've turned out to be, the star of the whole group. A lot of them aren't even there anymore. One, I think, is still left. And as it happened, our project was the only one that succeeded. And I know that because I ran into a Wharton professor some years after this all ended, who had done a big research project on it, and he told me, he said this out, that he had done the research about how these banks had been selected and why that the World Bank had done a very bad job of that, and had come to the conclusion that the Alpha Bank project was the only one that had been successful, which was not done according to the World Bank's idea of how it should have been done. And if
Mm.
it had been, it would have failed too. But part of the failures had to do, of course, with the crisis in 1998.
Yeah. But what was it that the World Bank wanted to do that you found wasn't effective or you didn't think was the right approach? What did they want?
They basically wanted us to put a person over there, and ultimately we did this just in a way too. But just to put a person over there and let them be there and answer questions and so on and so forth. And what I wanted to do was to have experts from various parts of our bank uh, work with the different departments, so that you had expertise in different things like technology or human resources or marketing. This not just have one person go over there and sit next to the bookkeeper.
Uh-huh.
But
Yeah.
and that's what we did, and it was extraordinarily successful. We partnered with the Royal Bank of Canada, Royal Bank of Scotland, and and they were very helpful in sort of bringing in the British side of things. And yeah,
Mhm.
it was an incredible project.
What did you find were the skills that were most needed by the Russians at that stage? What did they need to know most?
They basically didn't understand asset liability management, which was what killed the banking system over there, and uh, which was a huge risk for Alpha Bank. Everybody had these huge amounts of money invested in the GKOs because the
Hmm.
government needed the money, and they probably put pressure on people to do that. But if you're getting a financial instrument that's paying 200% of your interest, that that's not a good idea. But they had enormous amounts of money in that market, and the question was, once they realized what was about to happen, how do you get out of it? And the risk management guy on our project told them what to do, and they they I won't give you the details. I mean, it's not a difficult thing, but anyway, they hedged it. They hedged that money. They had no idea how to do that sort of thing. Even
Hmm.
Alpha Bank, and Alpha Bank was far and away the most sophisticated of the Russian banks at that time. So they
Right.
didn't understand asset liability management, which is very basic, and they didn't have uh, good technology at all. Now
Mm.
they're one of the most sophisticated technology banks in Europe.
Mm.
But at
And
that,
but by technology, you mean more than hardware. It's a software and management um,
yeah,
software.
they had
Yeah.
basically they had branches, and the branches had a laptop, or not a laptop, but a desktop computer, and that branch kept all the records for all its customers on that computer. They had no centralized accounting system. Every branch was basically an independent little bank,
Right.
which is part of the reason why they couldn't do asset liability management, because they couldn't pool all their money into one place, and lend money from one branch to customers of another branch, as banks in the West would do. I mean, you have to have centralized technology, and they didn't have that.
Hmm.
Very primitive technology.
Right. And they had been in business for how long at the time in which you started working for them, with them rather?
Well, it was 1997, and things collapsed in 2000. I mean, in 1990,
98.
1991. So very few years.
Yeah, so but they had been operating as a bank.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, but
and they were
many of these, the Russian banks were what was referred to as pocket banks. They
yeah,
were
and they were
connected
pocket
to
bank.
some industrial group, and this,
Yeah,
they were
yeah,
also, is right,
that's
right?
right. That's right. They
Okay,
were the pocket bank for Alpha Group.
for the Alpha Group,
Right.
which was primarily in what?
They had a huge investment in the gas and oil industry. Uh, Friedman was the one. Well, that's another long story. There's so many long stories here, but he's the one who got, I think it's at the Sakhalin oil fields, which they
Hmm.
basically managed to legally get taken away from a consortium of companies, including Harvard, people like that who owned them, and they did it legally. They did it, but they got ownership of it. So then they had, and then he rebuilt it with a partnership with Halliburton under an Exim Bank loan. So that was a big piece of their business. He had started out as a sort of a trader, so he had a lot of small trading companies, uh, and that was sort of his beginning stuff. And
Hmm.
then he went in at some point later on. He went into mobile technology. The Beeline company was
Right.
Alpha Bank. They're
Okay.
very, communications technology, all that sort of thing. They were big, but at the
Well,
time we were there, I'm trying to remember if they'd done the Sakhalin oil deal at that time. I don't think they had.
yeah.
I think they were probably a pocket bank for.
So at this point, was Alpha Bank, I don't know how to ask this, was it a real bank or was it an adjunct of the industrial group, or was it trying to become a real bank? In other words, were its clients only this industrial group, or was it becoming something else?
No, they were becoming something else. They were a genuine retail bank, and they had branches, and their intention was to expand their branch system, and they did that dramatically after the banking system collapsed. Friedman used that as an opportunity to go out and buy up the branch offices of all these banks that had failed. And
Mm,
so he exploded the bank just overnight I mean, he is one of the smartest people you'll ever meet. I have huge respect for the guy. I think he's an honest man. He's a smart man. He's a person I've seen him in situations which required considerable character, uh, and um, and he never disappointed me.
mhm,
I feel like he's gotten a very bad rap in general, and where he's been accused of malfeasance, he's always been proved in the end to be innocent of it.
mhm.
But anyway, he was smart enough to jump on that opportunity and just expand the system overnight when they failed. So his idea was to become the largest retail bank in both in Russia and also in Europe.
Yeah.
He's
And
done. I don't know if he's the biggest in Europe, but he certainly.
so if just to back up a bit, so then your assistance helped the bank in a way dodge the bullet of the 1998 collapse. In other words, they were either hedged or able to preserve their asset base as a result of the collapse of the government bond market in 1998. Is that
Yeah, but
correct?
we did two things, and that was sort of in the moment, the one, and I have a letter from Friedman uh, saying that we had helped save Alpha Bank, and and we did. I mean, I know what happened there. They took out a Lombard loan as a hedge and so on and so forth. Anyway, then they managed to preserve and convert a lot of their assets into hard currency right before the market collapsed. And
Uh-huh.
they were left with the hard currency. And that's one of the things that saved them. The other thing that saved him was that Friedman put huge amounts of his own money into funding the deposit outflow until depositors believed that the bank was going to survive, and then the money started to come back in, which was I was there when that happened. I have to say it was quite a remarkable experience to watch it. The other thing that we did for them, though, was to recommend that they centralize their IT operations. And there again, the man who was in charge of IT, there was a big competition this is a typical Russian thing. And you asked me, one of the questions that you asked me gets at this cultural thing. And this was a very good example of it. There was a big competition between the IT group and the retail banking group. Well, you can't do that. I mean, their IT's should own. I mean, they're it's like the right hand and the left hand. But the IT guy didn't want that centralization because he didn't want to deal with the retail people. He was going to let them run their own little, desktop operations. And he wouldn't, we advised him to centralize it. And we tried, when we were having the internships with these people, that we would bring over the IT people and the retail people together so they would get to know each other. And he didn't even want to do that. But then I asked for an executive briefing with Friedman on two topics. One was risk management, and that's when my colleague told them about what to do about hedging. And the next day, there was a line outside his office of all these financial people wanting to tell, and say, what should we do about this, that, and the other thing? And they did it. This was 3 weeks before the collapse that
Wow.
briefing took place.
Wow.
And the other executive briefing was on IT, when we explained why centralized IT was going to be essential to the growth of the retail network. And and we hadn't gotten back to our office. Our office was in the same floor of a different building as the guy who was head of IT. And by the time we'd gotten back to our office, Friedman had called this guy and said, "Do it." And so we were, and after was very interesting, because also this was right before the crisis. After the crisis, I canceled the trip of the IT guy over there. I mean, I thought this was, the whole thing was over. And they were just furious. They were full steam ahead. They were continuing with everything they were going to do before. Um, that they were quite remarkable people, really. And
Mhm.
Friedman especially, just amazing guy.
And how often were you in Russia at that time?
I was there every 6 weeks, probably.
And every 6 weeks. And how big was your team that was working with Alpha Bank?
I think there were about 10 of us,
Yeah.
maybe a
Okay.
dozen, counting the
Yeah.
people from the Royal Bank of Scotland.
But that was a pretty substantial commitment of people then. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
In other words, from our bank standpoint,
Yeah. Yeah.
well, this is another sort of interesting little how things happen wrinkle to it. Our bank had been sold by the time the project got started. We had been sold to another bank. And so everybody was just sitting around waiting to get fired. And so nobody was paying a bit of attention to what I was doing. And so you know, I got what I wanted, and, because people were glad to have something interesting to do. And a number of my people were people who were outside the bank, who had been laid off at some point in some past um, overhaul of the organization. So it was just one of those made for the moment situations.
Right. And how did now I'm assuming most of the folks you were involved with, including you didn't have any experience with Russia. You
No,
were you knew, obviously, as educated people, you knew about Russia and you paid attention, but what was it like to encounter Russia in 1997, and to be parachuted into, this completely different environment? Were people enthusiastic? Were they optimistic? Were they energized?
you
Or were they appalled and repelled?
you mean our team?
Yeah, your team. Yeah.
Oh, I think we were all just fascinated.
Hmm.
First of all, the Russians are the Alpha Bank people were, these were nuclear scientists. Uh, the people who had these very sophisticated jobs in Soviet times, they became bankers. That's
Hmm.
where the good jobs were. Uh, Pilots from the Air Force. I mean, they're just very interesting people, very sophisticated people. And and they were very excited to have us there. Uh, and I mean, that again had a lot to do with Friedman. I mean, he just, he made it clear that they understood that their job was to participate in and contribute to this project. So they were very, very receptive to us. We had a wonderful coordinator who's a very dear friend of mine to this day. Um, and he's one of these people who knew how to connect people,
Hmm.
and although he wasn't a particularly senior guy at the bank, he had been in Afghanistan twice,
Hmm.
and so he had sort of elevated status among his peers at the bank as somebody, somebody special who had been into Afghanistan twice. So
Hmm.
he was very effective, very effective.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
mean, we just a lot of things came together, in interesting ways.
Hmm. And some of your team was resident there, or did you
Well,
all just travel in and out?
uh, one person was resident there, and he was a major part of our success. He had been the president of he'd been with one of the big eight accounting firms, a partner, and then he was the head of a major accounting S&L firm company in California, which failed. You remember the big S&L crisis and all
Yes,
the banks failed.
yes.
He's a very distinguished guy. I'd been on the Federal Reserve Advisory Committee with him, and he was appointed to represent the S&L industry. And after he retired, he decided he wanted to get this experience in that part of the world. And so he uh, he was interested in going over there and living. And of course, I was thrilled to have him do it. Um, so he was and everybody, he was a gray haired, elegant, genial kind of a guy. And he just did very well with the Russians. They adored him. And he was a very effective part of our project too. Everybody else was in and out.
Hmm. And language, everything was done in English?
Yes.
Yeah. And the Alpha people were generally had good facility with English?
Some yes and some no.
Hmm.
We had a translator assigned to our team.
Hmm.
And so we often were working through a translator, but many of the Alpha people spoke very good English.
And did you ever feel that any of them sort of resented you telling them what to do?
Never,
Never. Yeah. They
never.
just wanted the knowledge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
one interesting conversation along that line was with the guy who ran their money transfer systems, and he was a nuclear scientist who was fascinated with black holes. And I guess money transfer can be a black hole. But anyway, he said to me when I first met him and was interviewing him, he said to me, we know that our system is not the right one, and yours is the right one, and you will teach it to us. And and I was taken aback by that, and I said immediately, I said, no, I said, we're not here we're here to help you develop a system that works for you. But
Hmm.
this gets at a cultural difference that in the Soviet Union, there was a right way, and everything else was illegal. Literally. I mean, you could go to jail for not believing in the right things because there was only one answer to things. And so that we ran into that mentality, and they thought that the Americans had the right answer. But our goal, and one of the stated goals for our team, I mean, I have those written down if that's of any interest to you. I think there were three or four things, and that was one of them was to teach them how to work together, and
Hmm.
one of them was to develop a system that was their system that fitted their culture and their resources and so on.
Hmm.
Um, and so that necessitated that we understood their system and how they did things.
Right.
Yeah, we were not there to teach them our way. And then a lot of people, I think that's a mistake that a lot of people who went to Russia made, was
Hmm.
thinking these are a bunch of yahoos who, we need to show them the truth and the light. I think we make
Right.
that mistake around the world, actually.
Hmm.
Um, I encountered a lot of disrespect among particularly among the Brits and the Americans who were working over there. And
Hmm.
I found it extremely unpleasant
Hmm.
and inappropriate.
And how was that expressed? Do you mean in terms of looking down on their Russian colleagues, or how would you say that
Yeah,
was?
well, they wouldn't say it in front of the Russians, but they would just, in conversation among us when we were having dinner together, whatever, in the hotel where we were staying, that, there would be just these conversations, rather contemptuous conversations about
Yeah,
whatever was going on.
right. Well, so how did you go about understanding Russian reality, what the reality was that Alpha Bank had to live in? How did you go about learning about that?
Well, I became very friendly with a number of them, who
Hmm.
and some of whom I'm friends with today. I also this one particularly effective guy, the one who had been in Afghanistan, ended up after the whole thing had ended. He ended up taking a job with a man who was Putin's economic advisor, who was
Uh-huh.
his personal assistant, and so he was introducing, and so this guy had been a part of the Guy Dar team.
Hmm.
And through that, I got introduced to about half of the Guy Dar team, which is this, quite an interesting bunch of people,
Uh-huh.
and very thoughtful people, very bright people, and people who thought a lot about had been thinking for 10 years before the Guy Dar team came together well before the Soviet Union collapsed.
Right.
And we're sort of meeting in secret, and talking about the future of Russia and so on and so forth. And so that's why when the Soviet Union collapsed, um, Yeltsin turned to Gaidar, who had already had the team put together and had been working
Hmm.
together, discussing these matters. They were in concert with, they were called the Zminka Group,
Hmm.
which means Snake Hill, and they worked with a university in St. Petersburg State University of Economics. Then it's now called Unicon, and so these people were very thoughtful, very interesting people who had, and you can have wonderful conversations with Russians. I mean, they like to discuss ideas way more than Americans do.
Hmm.
And so the conversations were always just fascinating. And so I spent a lot of time with those guys. And there was one woman, just talking about their experiences and what had happened, during they had some astonishing experiences during the Gaidar period.
Hmm.
Kidnappings and I mean, very just it. I could write my own book about all that stuff. So I so I got to know them, and I had my Alpha Bank friends, and then I got involved with Sharon Tennyson, and her uh, scope was teaching entrepreneurs from the regions. Not She didn't get people from Moscow because she figured they had enough opportunities. Uh, they recruited from St. Petersburg and the regions, and so I traveled around a lot with her to the regions and got to know
And this was after
after
the
Alpha Bank.
World Bank program ended.
Yes,
Okay, and it ended because of the crisis?
yes,
Okay, all right. But that was your platform to then move on with Sharon Tennis.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
Okay, I'm
yeah.
sorry.
Lots of
Just
other,
want to get it straight.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But here's another piece of that, the ending of that project. Our project was going full steam ahead. We had made huge gains, and Alpha Bank was on record about it. And they wrote to the World Bank, and we went to the World Bank and said, "Please let us keep this project going. It's a great success. We've saved this bank in this crisis, so on and so forth." They want us, they'd written and asked for it to continue. And here's what they said to us. They said Alpha Bank was on one of our suspect lists. something like that.
Uh-huh.
And I said, well, how many of the banks that are alive today were not on your suspect list? I mean, the answer being clear, they'd all
Yeah.
folded. The suspect list wasn't worth the paper it was written on.
Right.
And they didn't like Alpha Bank because Alpha Bank refused to tell them who the owners were.
Uh-huh.
And so that was always a big source of suspicion. Well, of course they didn't want to tell them who the owners were. You like painting a target on your back.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
you you just don't do it. And if you understood anything about Russia in those days, when these guys are driving around in armor-plated cars, with whole battalions around them to protect them, and bankers are getting murdered on the streets of Moscow with rockets. I mean, that you had to. It was a dangerous business. I mean, Friedman had armed men sitting outside his office.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And we had armed people all over the place to get in our hotel and everything. But anyway, the World Bank had decided that although it was the bank, and that was the bank that everybody went to, by the way, when everything crashed, and all these international agencies had personnel over there, and they wanted to pay their people off and close down the offices. And who did they call to help them get the money out? They called me
Mm.
because they knew I could get it done through Alpha Bank. In other words, they had sent money over. It had disappeared in some of their good banks. Anyway, the point is that their list was worthless.
Was worthless. Right.
Yep.
Yeah. But still, they use that as a justification then to stop the
To
program.
stop the project, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. So why do you think the World Bank was so ill informed? I mean, I think I'm not sure how you would characterize it, but was it, it just occurs to me that, you know, you had insights that they just as well could have had. Um, do you have any idea
No,
why?
I don't know. I don't know if they could just as well have had. I mean, bureaucracies are bureaucracies, and with respect to Russia, there was not much of a foundation to build on with about knowledge inside of Russia.
Uh-huh.
And so I don't really know how they got whatever knowledge they had. I mean, I will tell you that the Russians are very contemptuous, it might be too strong a word, but of all these people who write books about Russia, they don't, and and some of them I read them and I think, good Lord, where are they, but you take three courses in one of the big universities, and you can write a book and you speak the language and you can write a book on Russia. I don't speak Russian, and I'm sure a lot of people would disqualify me as being knowledgeable just because I don't speak Russian, but uh I don't know. I don't know how people claimed to get knowledge about Russia back in that day. And I
Hmm.
think I was astonishingly lucky to happen to fall into a couple of really astonishing nests, Alpha Bank being one, and this Gaidar group being the other. And then the third leg of it was these entrepreneurs who were quite
Uh-huh.
remarkable people, and to
Yeah.
watch how that was developing. And there again, that people's attitudes about what goes on in Russia just didn't match up with what I saw. I'd go to
Hmm.
these small towns and there'd be nice restaurants and nice hotels and nice people and so on and so forth. And I remember there was a man named Edward Lucas who used to write for The Economist, just the most astonishingly horrible articles about Russia, and he was a laughing stock at anybody who was there. He just, you know, I don't know why they thought he was competent to write about Russia.
Right.
It
Right.
certainly it certainly dampened um my attitude towards The Economist, I have to say.
Yeah. So, I mean, you were coming back and forth in these years. I want to come back to Sharon Tennyson. I don't want to let that go. I just am curious about this. And because I guess maybe because of my own experience, you had direct experience. You had, conversations at pretty high level with people there. And what was the reaction when you came home and talked to people in Philadelphia about Russia?
That's sad. That question has a sad answer. Um, I'd say that even though I think I have a very educated, sophisticated group of friends who travel widely, there wasn't much interest.
Hmm.
In the days when when it was considered more interesting, and as time went on and Putin became the bad guy and all that, then you know there's a lot of bigotry in this country towards Russia,
Hmm.
and certainly among my friends too.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's rare that I find somebody that I really can talk to about Russia.
Yeah. 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 No, that also was my experience. So I don't want to dwell on that because I want to make sure we cover, what that experience is that you had. And I want to come back to Sharon Tennyson. Am I correct that she developed this entrepreneurship program in the regions in a way it was different than the US government programs, which required that people speak English, that she didn't require people to speak English, and that she, I believe, did some work with the Rotary Club to help her
She
with this?
did, yeah.
Okay. So maybe you could just kind of describe this program and what she developed and then what you experienced with it.
Well, it by the time I got involved, it was pretty widely considered to be the most successful internship program uh, between the United States and Russia. There were a number of programs going on, and mostly they ended up being opportunities for people to come over here and go shopping.
Hmm.
Uh, the program that one of the things that was different about the program that Sharon developed was that the entrepreneurs had to pay part of their own way. I think they had to pay half, maybe. And so they had some skin in the game. Uh, and her book will describe to you how she managed to get connected with Rotary. Um, and I'm not sure exactly when she started to get government funding. I think by the time I met her and became involved in it, that we already had government funding. And I know that I went with her on calls to government officials fairly
Hmm.
regularly
Hmm.
to talk about the program. And everybody was very complimentary of it and said, it was the best program that we were doing there. And
Hmm.
they trained something like 6,000 entrepreneurs all over the country and developed quite a loyal group. Uh,
Hmm.
she has had reunions, big reunions, where people come all the way to the United States for these reunions. Um, so they
How long a program was it? What were they in? Was it like a short educational program? Was it an internship program? Just can
It
you
was an internship
describe
program. Yeah,
internship?
yeah,
Okay.
they were selected to come over. I think the normal stay was about 2 weeks. I ran one for lawyers myself. Um, which was a strange group, I have to say. I don't think they did a great job of selection on the other side for that one, but a lot of them were. But I'm thinking that was coming at a funny time too, after the economy had collapsed and everything, and so there were a lot of reasons why people were sort of had a different attitude about stuff. But they'd come over for a couple of weeks. They would be housed with people who lived in that city. They would be matched up with and they were counterparts, industry counterparts. So cheese makers would go meet with cheese makers, and furniture makers would meet furniture makers, and that sort of thing. In my case, lawyers met lawyers, and judges,
Hmm.
and so on and so forth.
Hmm.
Um, and they would meet with them. They would see their facilities. They would, ask them questions, um, just sort of compare notes on how they did things.
Hmm.
And the program ultimately sort of died because the entrepreneurs became so sophisticated that they weren't learning much anymore.
Uh-huh. Huh.
Yeah,
What were the years that you're talking about then, where you were involved with this?
I was involved 2001 maybe,
Hmm.
maybe 2000. I can't remember exactly. I could look all that up, but
Yeah.
um
That's okay. I don't need it exactly, but it's around the 2000, 2001, 2002. So then how long did it continue until it reached a point where they didn't need it anymore?
Oh, I'm not sure I can be explicit about that. It would
Okay.
it would probably have been. I'm reluctant to give you that as a part of the record. I could look it up.
Well, yeah,
But I would say that. Sorry.
a ballpark number year.
Well, I don't know. Well, 2008, of course, was the big global financial crisis. That may have taken a big bite of it out.
Yeah. Okay. But the early 2000s. And
Oh
and
yeah,
then
yeah, yeah,
yeah, and then some the people who participated in this I mean, I'm sure that she did follow up and so on, but I assume that some of them became fairly successful in their
yeah.
in their localities
They
and
did. Yes,
throughout Russia, right?
yes, yeah. Very successful.
Yeah, yeah. And my um, understanding is that the Rotary clubs also spread throughout Russia, that there were a lot of
Mhm.
active Rotary clubs
Yeah,
throughout Russia, right, to
yeah,
promote local business.
yeah.
That, yeah, yeah.
I don't know what's happened to that now. It'd be interesting to find out.
Yeah, I don't know. When I was researching the book, I contacted some people from the Rotary Club, but my interviews were all done before the war in Ukraine and
Ah,
before 2022. So I don't know what has happened since then. I mean, I can guess, but sometimes guessing doesn't work with Russia. So, you know,
well, here's what I would guess. I would guess that the Rotary Club is no longer officially involved, but that the seeds were planted. There's so many seeds that were planted. And one of your questions, I've forgotten exactly how it was phrased, but is it all for naught? And
right.
no, I absolutely don't believe that. I think they learned an incredible amount. I mean, the changes that I saw in the time I was there, and I was going until right before COVID.
Hmm.
um, the changes were just astonishing. Uh, just astonishing. And even if you talk about the regions, the changes were just astonishing.
Hmm.
And so you'd have a crisis, and all of a sudden you couldn't afford imports anymore, and so all of a sudden they learned how to make their own. I remember when
Right.
they had the crisis where they couldn't import cheese from France and all that. Well, then they all of a sudden, instead of sending Dannon in all the grocery stores, you're seeing the Russian version of it, and they do it overnight. I mean,
Hmm.
it's just fascinating how fast those people can adjust to a crisis. After the crisis of 1998, I was just devastated. I mean, I just thought this is the end. They'll
Hmm.
never
Hmm.
survive this. Well,
Hmm.
nobody. I remember walking around Red Square on a bright, sunny, wonderful fall day, and nobody looked the least bit excited about it. Everybody's out having a nice time and enjoying the fall weather and everything. And looking at me when I would talk to somebody, let it be known that I was pretty upset, they'd look at me like, "What's the matter with you?" They had some of these entrepreneurs that we were involved with set up barter enterprises within 3 weeks.
Hmm.
They just organized somehow or another ways to trade truckload of tires for truckloads of popcorn. I mean, it was just astonishing. Alpha Bank did the same thing. Alpha Bank figured out a way to net out their transactions so that they could cut way down on the amount of capital that was needed to run the system. They did that in 3 weeks. The Federal Reserve Bank in the United States took years to do that. But boom, Alpha just did it.
Hmm.
And suddenly, the money was able to move at, pretty much the rate that it had before the ruble had dropped in value by 75%. I mean,
Hmm.
they barely hiccuped over all that.
Yeah, yeah. I have to say, I think when you were saying that, I was thinking about the ineffectiveness of sanctions and how
Oh
the
yeah, exactly.
flexibility of
Exactly.
Russians has
Yeah.
been able to evade the dire impact of sanctions.
Well, not only sanctions, but shutting down their access to the funding for the central bank. That's the
Yeah,
one I really thought was going to do them in. And frankly, I think it was a very stupid thing for America to do because I think everybody's going to think twice about putting their reserves in the value in the dollar. But
right,
no,
right.
I thought that was going to kill them. I don't. I'm just fascinated. And those,
Hmm.
by the way, the people, Nabulyana, who was the head person there, was part of this guy. I never knew. Well, I've met her, I think, but she was a part of that Gaidar group too. Those people,
Uh,
the group, that group is still in one way or the other. The heads of the banks, or heads of the investment banks, or head of the
right,
railroads, or whatever. They've
right,
they've they've
right.
held on in a lot of positions.
Right. Well, one theme about that period that maybe I don't know if you have an opinion about, but as I interviewed people, then capital markets developed after the collapse of the Soviet Union. There were no capital markets. All capital was allocated by centralized planning.
Mm,
So there were banks that developed as these adjuncts of the industrial groups, and then there were investment banks and investment groups and some private equity.
mm,
And the US government was very active in setting up the stock exchange and in, setting up the RTS and in providing advice about the stock exchange as a way of allocating capital.
mm,
And it seemed that there was a conflict between banks and stock market as who was going to be the arbiter of economic input from capital. And it looks like pretty clearly banks won that battle rather than the stock market. As here, stock market has a lot to do with, the allocation of capital. I don't know. Am I imagining this, or is this something that you saw or have any thoughts about?
Well, Bernie Sutchers would be a wonderful source for you on this because he was one of the partners who started Troika Dialogue, which
Right.
is probably still the largest investment bank in Russia, and they started it from nothing.
Yeah.
He and the Armenian guy whose name doesn't pop into my head, but who is I
Yeah.
think is still a big major player over there. Um, and the guy who started the stock market uh, was the husband of one of the members of the Gaidar group, who is still a good friend of mine. He was quite a character. Um, so I knew these people when these things were just getting started,
Yeah.
and that the question that you're asking about where capital ended up, um, I don't know the answer to that. I can't. It seems to me that all of them had their ups and downs.
Hmm.
I mean, certainly the banks did. Um, but I'm not a historian in economics. I'm sure somebody
Right.
studied all that.
Right,
But
right.
I don't know the
It's
answer.
okay. I just thought you might have an opinion about it, so that's all.
Well, I will tell you this. The latest that I can remember, not my information may be out of date now, but Sberbank bought Troika Capital.
Hmm.
So
Right.
it was a subsidiary.
Yeah.
And Sberbank was, the old Soviet retail
Right.
bank.
Savings bank. Yeah.
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 And as far as I know, it still owns.
Ah, okay.
So that would suggest to me that
The
the
banks
banks,
have
the
done
banks
it.
won.
Right.
Well, the banks in the state. I mean, now,
Right.
all this stuff is getting taken back over by the state. Um, I mean, I just, I have an economist friend who's quite expert in all this stuff, and he would be able to answer that, but
Right.
I
Right.
can't. I just remember knowing about it in the baby days.
Right. Right. Well, so after when you were working with Sharon Tennyson in this entrepreneurship program, what was your role in that? Was it to run specific programs, or was it as a trainer, or what were you doing with it?
Um, I was on her board, uh, and I traveled with her and, went to I mean, I think, I think to some extent I was just a warm body that added a certain presence
Uh-huh.
to
Yeah.
the thing as opposed to just Sharon being by herself.
Yeah.
Uh, and so I learned a lot from it. I'm not so sure how much I was contributing to it other than just being, a
Right.
presence.
Right.
And I had the Alpha Bank experience, which
Right.
probably gave me a little weight in the conversation. Um, but and I did run one of the projects here in
Right. The
Philadelphia,
lawyers.
the
Right.
lawyer project.
Right.
Um,
Do you have any memory of
I,
any specific regions that made an impression on you in your travels around the country?
well, I remember we went down to Volgograd, which was just we had a wonderful trip down there. First of all, I remember taking the train, and as we were coming into the city, I didn't know about the statue, and the name's not popping into my head, but this statue that's what, two or three times the size of the statue.
Right.
Do you know what I'm
Mother
talking about?
Russia, the Mother Russia statue. Yeah.
Yeah. And that all of a sudden that came into the window of the train, and I just gasped. I mean, it was incredible. And then one of the oligarchs from that our program was in Volgograd, and so he took us out on his yacht, and it was quite an exciting city. Uh,
Mm.
I remember going to a well, I did a lot of work actually in Ekaterinburg. That would be the one where I would have the biggest impression, because after I sort of went out on my own after I'd worked with Sharon for a while and worked with she had representatives in each city that she worked with, and Ekaterinburg was one of the big ones and one of the more active recruiters for her. And so this woman would set up seminars for me to teach at universities or
Mm.
in various sponsors, and I would teach courses in business management kind of thing.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I did that a number of times in Ekaterinburg, um, and other places too. One in Tatarstan, which I liked, Kazan, which I liked a
Yeah.
lot too.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Um, but every place we went was, as I say, it was always, there's a little town called Penza, which is hard not on anybody's screen, but it was a lovely little place, nice little town. The guy
Hmm.
with one of the entrepreneurs had a bear that he kept in a pit in his backyard. I mean, and drove one of um, Khrushchev's old limousines or something like that that was bigger than his mother's little Isbot. They're just real characters involved in her program.
Hmm.
Uh, they, I mean, you have this image of Russia as sort of these cowed people. I mean, they are not, there was so much always going on. Everybody thinks that the state ruled everything. They had their own lives, completely independent of what the government was doing. They did what they wanted.
Hmm.
Uh, and seeing how budgets worked and some stuff like that was quite interesting.
And so this whole experience, which you had you didn't know anything about Russia, it changed you, right?
Oh, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Everybody on our team would say that. Everybody on our team and all the people that we worked on the Russian side, everybody said it was a life-changing experience.
Hmm. Hmm.
Everybody felt that way.
Yeah. Yeah. And life-changing, not just in the experience, but how else? How else would you say it was life-changing?
Well, um, I understanding Russia. That was my objective in wanting to go over there. Aside from the fact that
Mhm.
I felt that from a project standpoint, I thought it was a very interesting project. But I really wanted to understand Russia. People talked about Russian soul and this kind of thing, and it was just this big black box. And I was just very curious about. about what that was and how people would live under a communist system like they had. I just no way to imagine it.
Hmm.
And I think I made I think my Russian friends tell me that I understand Russia pretty well now.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and so I mean, God knows I could have I could have gone further, but to understand, you know, another completely different way of thinking and living uh, was just a fascinating cultural experience.
Yeah.
And you know, the friends I made there, just you know, fascinating people.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know. I have to think more about
Yeah.
it. Be more
Well, no,
specific
but
about it.
it's that insight or knowledge that you got that I want to try to preserve through this process of doing the interview with you. And that's part of the goal of this.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's one of those things that I'm not sure you can explain it. Russia is not it's not easy to explain Russia, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But you know what I do understand now is that I think I think that we not understanding Russia has caused a terrible crisis. I don't think I don't think we needed to be where we are now with this
Hmm.
war.
Hmm.
I do not forgive Putin for what he's done. I mean, I was explaining to a Russian friend of mine about a week ago about this, and she's going through all the reasons why think bad stuff that we had done, you know, moving forward with NATO and so on and so on and so forth. And I said, look, I agree with you about all that. I said, but let me give you an analog here. Let's say the two neighbors have a problem with each other, and one of them is really nasty and does all kinds of bad stuff that get on the nerves of the other person, and it goes on for a while. And finally, the good neighbor murders the bad neighbor. That's that there's no excuse for that.
Hmm.
No
Hmm.
matter what other bad stuff may have preceded it, there is no excuse for that. And so I think feel that way about this war. But I wish that we had done a number of things differently. I mean, we treated them we treated Putin like an outsider from the beginning,
Hmm.
and he finally, I think, just said, "Okay, then I'll be an outsider."
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and I don't think it needed to happen.
Yeah. 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 Wow. Okay. I don't know if there are things that you wanted to discuss that we didn't get to in this interview. Are there? Because I think we're kind of have wrapped our arms around this and gotten
Yeah,
experience. So, um, is there more that you wanted to say or
yeah.
that
Those,
I
you know,
didn't ask you about?
I could go on for days about my experiences in Russia. I had fascinating experiences there, but we've covered the top line of the big pieces of my. Well, I
Okay.
guess not. No, I guess there is one more piece actually, pretty big piece, as a matter of fact. Um, after the experience with Sharon, uh, let me see if I can remember how this. One of my Gaidar group friends introduced me to the university in St. Petersburg, which is a very big one. It's not the St. Petersburg State University. It's the one that's I don't know if you know St. Petersburg very well, but
Yeah.
anyway, it's called Unicon. It was
Yeah, I actually met the vice rector there at one point, so I know
oh,
what you're talking about. There's a
Maximsev.
Yeah, I think you might have introduced me. I'm not even sure back when we first started this, but that's okay. Go ahead with it.
Well, his name is Maximsev now. He replaced somebody when I first started working with them who had been very corrupt. Uh, but anyway, so it's now called Unicon. And so my friend Slava, who was one of the Gaidar group, took me up there to that university, and I was supposed to help with them. They're designing some new curriculum or something or other. And so I met with the rector and so on and so forth. And they were very eager to have a connection, an American connection. They had a program for American students and so on and so forth, and they wanted help with introductions in the United States. And I found out while I was there that they had a terrible reputation for corruption. And so I couldn't let that one go. And I had a colleague at Wharton who I'd done some work with when the lawyers had come. And so I got him. What I did was I wrote a letter to Maxime Sev, and I said, we really appreciate meeting with you and working with your university and be happy to continue it. But I said, there's a major issue here. There's, this corruption. And I understand this corruption issue. And I've forgotten how I put it, but I said, I think we would like to work on this with you and like to have Unicon change its brand to standing for ethics, for business ethics.
Mm.
And so they agreed to that, and we started a series of seminars, which we did every year with my colleague from Wharton and I and this Guy Dar guy who was a professor at that university, and we would organize pretty important conferences with people like Jack Matlock, for example, was our keynote at one point, and we had some pretty big names who participated in those things to discuss about Russian values
Mm.
and business ethics and stuff. And that sent me off on another leg, which involved developing an online evaluation system of business ethics for companies to use, which I did with a lot of meetings with corporations in Russia and all that, and we got it developed and up, and it was funded by the Eurasia Group. Got it up and running, and then things sort of came apart at when the Putin thing. It had. I guess it came apart, right, or didn't come apart until COVID. And COVID sort of shut things down, and then events since then.
Yeah.
So that
So
sort of
it,
died.
it
But
lasted past 2014 then. You were
oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Oh
yeah,
yeah.
okay.
No, I did a lot of work on my own past 2014,
Right.
mostly with this colleague from Wharton, and we would go over. I would go over at least twice a year, maybe three times, and he was usually with me one or two times. And
Right.
we did various seminars in various places. Plus, we did this annual seminar with Unicon. Unicon was FinEc.
Yes, right,
Yeah.
right. I know those acronyms. So who came to these seminars on ethics, business ethics?
Um, it was a lot of academics, but a lot of business people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they were responsible. Unicon was sort of responsible for the guest list, and it would be some political people. One of the people that was one of our speakers when one of the last ones was the deputy minister of, oh boy, it was a big agency that had to do with standards and stuff like that. He was a lovely guy.
Mm-hmm.
So we had people from the political realm,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but as I say, a number of academics and the academics and business people,
Right.
basically.
So you were advocating for forms of business ethics, and what was the incentive then for Russian business people to adopt that kind of ethical approach?
Well, they wanted to do global business.
Okay.
They were if a lot of these people were working for American companies, uh, and and so they were interested in it because their American companies were interested in it,
Mm-hmm.
and anybody who wanted to do business with them, would the idea of this online self-evaluation system was for them to demonstrate their proficiency on these subjects to potential um, you know, partners in suppliers, contractors, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And to use it as an internal auditing tool too. And it was quite well received.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they helped develop it.
Right.
They were part of seminars where we would talk about what issues needed to be confronted with it, and
Mm-hmm.
things like anonymity of whoever was filling out the form and stuff like that. And there were some very interesting cultural issues that came up there. But we spent a lot of money getting this thing online, and it was
Right.
of interest to international groups and everything. And then poof,
Yeah.
it
What
disappeared.
what was what was maybe the either the most important concept that you were trying to get across, or maybe the most difficult concept in terms of that business culture that you were trying to bring?
Well, actually, uh, in the process, I ended up getting very interested in the subject of trust,
Mm-hmm.
and I realized through my experiences in Russia, maybe this is glad you brought that question up, because actually that may be my most important takeaway, is the importance of trust. Russians are not trusting people, as I'm sure you know.
Mm-hmm.
And it's as one person said to me, it's poison in our veins. And so developing, getting them to understand the importance of trust. And my Wharton colleague and I were published actually on the Russian International Affairs Council website, which is the think tank of the Ministry of Foreign Relations. But we published an article on stakeholder trust,
Mm-hmm.
and we published articles in the United States too. And that is, I mean, I think that's the key to good business. Good, it's the key to everything. I mean, personal relations, political, international relations, everything. If you don't have trust, you just got no foundation.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so ultimately we sort of morphed from business ethics techniques and stuff. I mean, there were lots of articles being written about business ethics rules and things back in those days, in various ways to measure it. And there was an ISO something or other that had pages and pages of questions you had to answer for that. And that ours was intended to be sort of an abbreviated version of that. Um, but it ultimately came down to, how do you establish trust? And one of the ways you do it is to know what the standards of behavior are, so that you can trust the way people operate.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you have a common language for what's appropriate conduct in managing your people and managing your relationship with your customers and so on. But it's, at the bottom line, it was about trust.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And and part of it was developing techniques for building trust.
Yeah, well, but build. I mean, like, obviously, the rule of law is a big piece of trust. As
Right.
you
Right.
have sort of, that's the importance in democracy, is not really as important as institutions. That you have a way of knowing what the rules are, and
Right.
expecting that everybody will have to abide by those rules.
Mhm.
Of course, we are now throwing that all into a cocktail in our
Right. Right.
world, but
Well, yeah. So my experience with Russians was trust was family members and
yeah,
school classmates.
yes,
Those were the networks of trust,
yes,
and strangers were not trusted.
that's right. That was
Okay.
my experience too.
Yeah. And so the idea that you would put an RFP out and select a company that you didn't know because they they won a competition you know, was kind of a very strange notion in a
Yeah.
context, you know. So,
Well, and the idea of this ethics, business ethics self-evaluation was to develop some common language
mhm,
for what the behavior was of the company, what the culture was in the company.
yeah,
And then
yeah,
you could, and if you could audit the results of this questionnaire,
mhm,
um,
mhm, mhm,
and give some assurance to, it's like auditors here. I mean, it gives some assurance to your counterparts that or your customers or your contractors or whoever that they can expect certain rules of behavior from you.
right. So this was just getting started when relations were breaking down. So do you know if it's still being used in any sense at all now?
I don't know, because basically the website was, all of a sudden the .ru websites disappeared.
Uh-huh.
And so I don't know. I mean, anybody who there were companies who were using it, and whether they're still using it, what happened to all that, I just don't know.
Mm-hmm.
We
Yeah,
gave a lot of seminars about it
right.
and introduced people to it and so on. We had a pretty good group of colleagues who were supportive of it and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But first of all, a lot of those people ended up getting transferred out of Russia by their companies.
Right.
Um, and so who knows? I've kept up with some of them, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
but I but I believe that in fact there's pieces of this stuff there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And whether it will morph into something else, I don't know. I don't know where it'll end up, but I do believe that there were seeds planted and they will grow.
Yeah. 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 Well, maybe that's a good place for us to sort of wrap this up because I think yeah, the future is unknown, but the point is it doesn't come from nothing, and it comes from seeds and from past practices that manifest themselves in ways that we can't predict.